Hello everyone, it's McCready Musings here. It's been a long time. In fact, I haven't made a video since last Christmas. 2023 has been... well, it's been hectic. But I'm back, and I'm here to talk about more of the history of Magic the Gathering. Even though we've now covered the complete history of MTG's standard legal sets, well, the complete history from 1993 until 2022, I'll have a video out later this year to cover the sets released in 2023, there are still loads of other things to talk about. I thought I'd start off by discussing the Commander series, Wizards of the Coast's first set of official Commander decks, released from 2011 to 2019. I'm sure if you're watching this video you already know what Commander is, as it's now the most common way people play Magic at local game stores. The game's most popular format started from humble beginnings in the city of Anchorage, Alaska, and was the brainchild of Adam Staley. The set Legends released in June 1994 and brought legendary creatures into the game, hence its name, I guess. Most notably, Legends introduced a cycle of 5 tricolour Elder Dragons. Staley thought these Elder Dragons were awesome, especially everyone's favourite evil spark-stealing charlatan Nicol Bolas. In 1996, he designed a format where players would build 3-colour singleton decks with these big, fire-breathing boys and girls at their head, Elder Dragon Highlander, or EDH.
In 2002, the fledgling format caught the attention of Sheldon Menery, a high-ranking tournament judge who would later become known as the godfather of Commander.
Menery transformed the format and brought it to a wider audience. He made a few modifications to the rules, most notably allowing any legendary creature to helm decks instead of just the 5 Elder Dragons.
I'm just gonna pause here. Unfortunately, after I wrote this section of script, Sheldon Menery passed away. After a 7-year-long struggle with throat cancer, Commander's godfather died peacefully in his sleep on the 7th September 2023. Cancer is a monstrous and awful disease, but the format Sheldon helped to define has brought happiness and hours of chaotic fun to millions of Magic players across the world. That's just a fantastic legacy to leave behind. The format kept developing, gradually and in the background, quietly drawing in more and more players.
Eventually, Wizards of the Coast took notice, and in June of 2011 they released Commander, a series of 5 decks for the format. They weren't able to use the name Elder Dragon Highlander because it's an homage to a 1986 film about immortal folks chopping each other's heads off, and this would have gotten them very, very sued. The name Commander has stuck around ever since though. It's punchy and brief, and it immediately conveys the main gimmick of the format. Let's dive into these 2011 decks and the other decks that followed them. We're going to briefly analyse each deck and talk about what worked and what didn't. We'll discuss how relevant their commanders remain today and pick a single card from each year to represent that batch of decks. In this video we're going to cover the decks released from 2011 to 2015, and then we're going to have for part 2 covering the decks released from 2016 to 2019. Let's get going. The first set of Commander decks are absolutely iconic, even if they seem very archaic now looking back on them. These decks defined the format, and all of their commanders still see widespread play. Based around the 5 wedges, in other words the 3-colour pairings which would later become the Clans of Tarkir, these decks are Heavenly Inferno in white, red and black, Mirror Mastery in blue, green and red, Counterpunch in black, white and green, Political Puppets in red, white and blue, and Devour for Power in green, black and blue. Heavenly Inferno is probably my personal favourite of these decks. You can get an idea of what this deck wants to do just by looking at its commander. Kaalia of the Vast is a 2/2 human cleric with flying for 4 mana. Whenever Kaalia attacks, you may put an angel, demon or dragon into play from your hand, tapped and attacking alongside her. This deck just wants you to fill the board with giant flying threats from 3 of the game's most iconic tribes. Is that a complicated game plan? Absolutely not. Is it popular? Absolutely. This is demonstrated by the fact that even now, 12 years later, Kaalia remains the 15th most popular commander of all time, with more than 13,500 decks to her name according to EDH Rec. New, powerful dragons, demons and angels are printed in just about every set, so there'll always be new brews to build around Kaalia. Next up is Mirror Mastery. Led by Riku of 2 Reflections, this 5-mana 2/2 earns their spot in the command zone by being a master of cloning. While Riku is in play, you can pay a red and a blue mana to duplicate any instants and sorceries you cast, and a blue and a green mana to duplicate any creatures. The game plan here is just to fill your deck with awesome and impactful big spells, and then get more value out of them by copying them as they enter play. Commander's main selling point, especially back in 2011, was that it was a slower paced format, where games would go on longer, giving you more time to cast awesome high cost cards that are too expensive to see play in 20-life formats. This deck emphasises that strength, and while Riku isn't quite as popular as Kaalia, with only 4,500 decks to their name, they're still a common sight in command zones today. Counterpunch is a deck all about +1/+1 counters. Do you see what they did there with the name? They're very clever.
I mean, the deck is also about sacrificing your creatures, making tokens, and doing funky graveyard stuff, but it's harder to fit all of that into a single pithy title.
Garve, Guru of Spores, is a 5-mana fungus shaman that enters play with 5 +1/+1 counters. For 1 mana, it can remove a +1/+1 counter from any of its controller's creatures and create a 1/1 Saproling token. It can then do the reverse, using 1 mana to sacrifice a creature to put a +1/+1 counter on something. There's also a graveyard and sacrifice sub-theme in this deck, with Garve's ability to turn creatures into +1/+1 counters, and cards like Teneb the Harvester and Carador Ghost Chieftain hanging around.
Garve is a useful toolbox commander. As a matter of fact, this groovy guru is notorious for enabling infinite combos. Garve's best friend is Ashnod's Altar. With these 2 cards in play, you're almost set up to win the game. This altar allows you to sacrifice one of a Saprolings Garve generates and end up 1 mana positive, albeit also 1 +1/+1 counter down. There are plenty of third cards you can plug in here which will enable you to go infinite. Kafar's Crusade lets you generate infinite mana and infinite +1/+1 counters, as does Mazaret, Crawl Death Priest, and Doubling Season lets you double the number of Saproling tokens you make, letting you sacrifice 1 to the altar and 1 to Garve to generate double the number of +1/+1 counters, enabling you to go doubly infinite. But you won't find Ashnod's Altar in this precon. In fact, while Garve may be a pretty great commander, the deck he's leading here isn't quite up to the same standard.
What's Celestial Force doing in here? This deck doesn't care about life gain. Cards like Aquastrand Spider and Afterlife also just aren't good.
All of the decks from this first wave of precons are a bit messy, but I think Counterpunch is probably the scrappiest of them all, Garve aside.
Political Puppets is a pretty interesting deck, and one designed to show off the scheming nature of Commander as a format, encouraging you to pit players against each other whilst protecting yourself. Zedru the Great-Hearted is a 4-mana 2/4 Minotaur monk, although I've always thought they looked a bit more like a goat than a Minotaur personally. At the beginning of your upkeep, Zedru gives you X life and allows you to draw X cards, where X is the number of permanents owned by you but controlled by your opponents. For 1 mana of each of the deck's colours, Zedru can also give a permanent you control to another player. The deck wants you to make deals with other players, giving them cards in exchange for incentivizing them to attack others or to do favours for you. There's also a lot of cards in here to ward off aggression, like Fogbank, Propaganda, and Ghostly Prison. These days, many Zedru decks are designed very differently from Political Puppets, deliberately giving their opponents harmful cards, like Gold Knight Castigator or 9 Lives. Whether you want to be a kind Zedru or a mean Zedru though, is entirely up to you when brewing around this commander. Devour for Power is the last of the Commander 2011 decks, and it's another classic. The Mimeoplasm is a really unique card that incentivizes hugely creative deck building. This 5-mana ooze exiles 2 creatures from graveyards as it enters play. It becomes a copy of one of those 2 creatures, giving access to all of their abilities, and it then gains a number of +1/+1 counters equal to the power of the other creature. Mill yourself, and your opponents, to load everyone's graveyards up with tasty creatures for the Mimeoplasm to devour, for power, and then bring it into play, and it turns into a really cool combination creature. The original deck had some pretty neat cards for the Mimeoplasm to copy, even including an Eldrazi, but this card has just opened up so many possibilities that there's always something fun to do with it, especially since it can steal from your opponent's graveyards as well. The card which I'm going to choose to represent 2011 is Command Tower. A signature land of the format debuted here, so it's got to be my choice. It's an auto-include in any Commander deck with 2 or more colours, right up there alongside Sol Ring. I also sort of love how this card is legal in a bunch of formats aside from Commander, where it does absolutely nothing. I respect it for being either one of your most useful lands, or a completely dead card, depending on the context you play it in. There were no Commander decks released in 2012. Instead, the Commander's Arsenal came out, containing several exciting reprints of legendary creatures and noteworthy cards for players lucky enough to get their hands on a limited number that got printed. When 2013 rolled around, we got a new set of Commander decks. These decks were still tricolour,
But while the Commander decks from 2011
were based around wedges, these decks are based around shards. Shards being a colour and its 2 allies, like the factions on Alara. And I guess now on New Capenna as well. Commander 2013 came with the decks Evasive Maneuvers in white, blue and green, Eternal Bargain in blue, white and black, Mind Seize in black, red and blue, Power Hungry in red, green and black, and Nature of the Beast in green, red and white. Evasive Maneuvers, as its name would imply, is focused on getting attacks through unblocked. That's partially achieved by having a bunch of flying creatures, like the deck's commander, Derevi Imperial Tactician, and also cards like Angel of Finality and Wonder. You can also get your attacks through by tapping down your opponent's creatures, using, well, Derevi again, or something like Dungeon Geists. The deck also has a bit of a Blink sub-theme. In fact, this deck has Rune of the Hidden Realm in it, who's one of the most popular Blink commanders of all time. Every turn, you can tap this Bant-dwelling Rhino to pop a creature in and out of existence for only 2 mana. These blinking shenanigans kind of synergise with Derevi, who has a positive ETB effect. Let's talk a bit more about Derevi. They're a 3 mana 2/3 with flying. When Derevi enters play, or a creature you control damages an opponent while Derevi is in play, you can tap or untap any permanent. Derevi's got a relatively unique ability, allowing them to be played from the command zone for 4 mana, skipping around the command attacks. This means that you can have access to their ability to tap and untap stuff at pretty much any time. Overall, Evasive Maneuvers is a pretty fun deck. It's quite unfocused, like a lot of these early decks, but that's arguably just a part of its charm. I hope you like Life Gain, because that's what Eternal Bargain is all about. When this deck was released, Oloro Ageless Ascetic was the Life Gain commander. These days, Oloro is still popular, with over 9,000 decks to their name, making him the 38th most popular commander of all time, but he's got a lot more competition, from cards like Dina Soulsteeper and Vito Fawn of the Dusk Rose. Oloro is a 6 mana 4/5 giant soldier. Oloro grants its controller +2 life every turn when he's in the command zone or in play, and also allows his controller to pay 1 mana to draw a card and deal 1 damage to each opponent whenever they gain life. Oloro was always a bit of a contentious commander. His ability to impact the game without being in play earned him some ire. Oloro enables your Ajani's Pridemates and your Sanguine Bonds, even if you never even play him. After 10 years of power creep, and a series of commanders with equally formidable effects that operate from the command zone released in 2017, Oloro definitely isn't as formidable as he once was, but slotting this card into your command zone may still raise a few eyebrows around the table. Orzhov Life Gain is a very common theme, but the blue in Oloro's cost doesn't really add a lot here. This can actually be seen looking at the deck, where lots of the blue cards just sort of carve out their own little artifacts matter sub-theme.
Some of these cards play into the deck's broader life gain strategy, while others just hang around at the corner of the party, kinda doing their own thing.
Mind Seize is a big spells-focused deck that cheats out high-cost instants and sorceries without paying for them. This cutting is achieved through the effect of this deck's commander, Jeleva, Nefalia's Scourge. A 1/3 flyer for 4, Jeleva is a flying vampire wizard. When Jeleva enters play, she exiles cards from the top of each player's deck equal to the cost paid to cast her.
Then when she attacks, she allows you to cast an instant or a sorcery from among these cards without paying their mana cost.
This is... well, honestly, it's a bit awkward. Since Jeleva doesn't have haste, she needs to survive a complete rotation of the board before she can attack and let you access any of the spells she exiled, giving everyone plenty of time to remove her. Every time Jeleva dies, she also loses access to the spells the previous iteration of her exiled, which is far from ideal. For this reason, Jeleva has the dubious dishonour of being outshone by the sub-commander of her deck, Nekusar the Mindraiser, who, at time of recording, commands 7,500 more decks than her. Beyond the underwhelming commander, well, at least underwhelming by today's standards, this deck does come with some pretty neat high-cost stuff for its time. Cruel Ultimatum, Army of the Damned, Decree of Pain, that sort of thing. This deck does come with a few too many X-cost spells though, which are effectively worthless when copied with Jeleva. Mind Seize is probably one of the least exciting decks we've discussed so far, but the commander that definitely hasn't stood the test of time. Power Hungry is a Jund Sacrifice deck, a classic theme with an even more classic commander, Prosh, Skyraider of Kur, who's a 6 mana 5/5 dragon with flying that creates a number of kobolds equal to the mana spent to cast it when he enters play. Prosh allows you to sacrifice other creatures to gain +1/+0 at any time, although slightly overshadowed by another Jund Sacrifice dragon in the form of Korvold Fey-Cursed King. You've got to love Prosh in all of his kobold-eating glory. This deck is a lot more consistent than many other decks of this era. Even the sub-commander, the Shattergang Brothers, follows the same sacrifice theme, even though it takes a slightly different direction, rather than trying to veer off and do something else. Good job, Power Hungry.
Next up is Nature of the Beast, a deck which really shows how the design of commander precons has changed over time. The commander, Morath, Will of the Wild,
costs 1 mana of each of the deck's 3 colours, and enters play with a number of +1/+1 counters on it equal to the amount of mana spent to cast it. You can then spend X mana to remove X counters from Morath to either deal X damage, put X counters on another creature, or create an elemental token with power and toughness equal to X.
Looking at the commander here, you might think this is a +1/+1 counter deck, when in fact it's actually kind of a combination of a beast typal and a power 5 or greater matters deck. More modern typal precons are chock full of lords, anthems, and other bonus effects that all very loudly reward you for playing as many cards as possible from a creature type the deck cares about. In contrast, Nature of the Beast has Ravenous Balor, a card that lets you sacrifice your beast to gain life. Yay? There's also Krosan Warchief, which does offer a genuinely useful 1 mana discount on all the beast spells you cast while it's in play. Far more of the cards in this deck, though, support its Power 5 or greater matters theme, like Mael the Animar and Where Ancients Tread. For bonus points, the deck also welds its 2 themes together, with a few beasts that care about you having cards with Power 5 or more, namely Rakeclaw Gargantua and Spellbreaker Behemoth. All in all, this deck is more freeform and a lot less prescriptive than more modern designs. Maybe this is a good thing. All the cards don't just say, play more beasts in big, screaming capital letters. But then again, maybe it isn't. You could argue this design is a lot less cohesive than the Lathril or the Wilhelt precons. It's a bit more of a disordered clump of cards than a refined, modernised Commander precon would be.
The card I'll be choosing to represent Commander 2013, well, it's pretty awful to play against, but it's definitely got to be the call. True Name Nemesis. True Name Nemesis was printed in Mindseas, that's the Jeleva deck, and in Commander, it's an interesting enough card. It gets protection from a player as it enters play, so if you're in a typical 4-player Commander pod, the card will be able to attack one of your opponents pretty much unimpeded, while also being very, very hard for them to interact with. This works great in a 4-player format, and the card is maybe a bit annoying, but overall a nice bit of fun. The problem is that all cards that are printed in Commander products are automatically made legal in Vintage and Legacy. In a 1 vs 1 game, True Name Nemesis is a frustrating nightmare to play against. While there are definitely more powerful cards in those formats, annoying or not, True Name Nemesis is no force of will, it's just a pain when your opponent plays a card which you have very, very few, if any, ways of dealing with. The set of 5 Commander decks released in 2014 are some of my personal favourites, although also some of the least played. Only 2 of the Commanders from this year command more than 1,000 decks on EDHREC. They're all mono-coloured, which is exceedingly rare for WotC Commander products. It's currently just these decks and the 40k Necron deck. They also all debuted the concept of Planeswalker Commanders, which are just conceptually really neat, since you get to play some of Magic's most iconic characters. Though it can be difficult to run Planeswalker Commanders, since, if they're powerful enough cards, there's a high chance you'll only get to activate one of their abilities once, and then everyone else at the table will rush them down prior to your next turn. Now, I really love monocolour Commander decks. I think it's fun because you have to build around the inherent restrictions of your colour, and you won't have access to every tool available. This was especially true back in 2014, before the massive campaign to give white and red more tolerable card draw began. So all of these decks are pretty exciting, but they're also all pretty limited. If monocolour Commanders are your cup of tea like they are mine, you might love these decks. Otherwise you may end up giving them a pass. We have the white Forged in Stone, the blue Peer Through Time, the black Sworn to Darkness, the red Built from Scratch, and the green Guided by Nature. Let's see what this single colour selection has in store. Forged in Stone is helmed by Nahiri the Lithomancer. It's an equipment themed deck. Nahiri gets this point across straight away. Her +2 ability enables you to create a core soldier token and slot an equipment card you have in play onto them. Her -2 lets you put a piece of equipment from your hand or graveyard into play, and her -10 creates an incredibly powerful equipment token that grants the creature wielding it +5/+5 in double strike. Personally, I feel like Nahiri the Lithomancer is a great little toolbox commander that does almost everything you want an equipment commander to do. Her -2 brings your equipment down and avoids paying its casting cost. Her +2 creates a token that can wield the equipment whilst cheating around its equip cost. So with all this in mind, why are there only 677 decks running this commander on EDHREC? Well, there are a few reasons. Overall, Forged in Stone is just a bit on the weak side. There just weren't as many quality pieces of equipment in the game 9 years ago as there are now. Instead of Colossus Hammer, Shadow Spear and Cauldron Complete, this deck runs Argentum Armour, Sword of Vengeance and Moonsilver Spear. This is compounded by white in 2014 having absolutely abysmal card draw. This deck relies on some awful card draw engines like Armistice and Loreseeker's Stone to maintain its momentum. But hey, at least it's got Skullclamp. But let's say you forget about the deck and you just want to build around Nahiri as a commander. Well, even though white now does have access to a lot more card draw, honestly with so many equipment commanders around in Boros, you'd be hard pressed to choose this Nahiri over Brunor Battlehammer or Astor Bearer of Blades, or even Nahiri Forged in Fury, and March of the Machine the Aftermath printing. So Forged in Stone isn't a great or powerful commander deck, but I've got a bit of a soft spot for it. That sort of sums up my feelings for lots of the 2014 EDH decks actually. Maybe they're not the strongest options out there, but ooh, at the end of the day, they're really just trying their best. Teferi Temporal Archmage clocks in as the commander of Peer Through Time. Unlike these days, where Teferi is rocking a dual-colour Azorius identity, back in 2014 he was simply mono-blue. Teferi's +1 ability, like many Planeswalkers' +1 abilities, is a card draw effect. It lets you look at the top 2 cards of your library and choose one to add to your hand and one to put to the bottom. Teferi's -1 lets you untap 4 permanents. This is probably his most useful effect, because it functionally gives you an extra 4 mana each turn, along with letting you repeat powerful tap effects like Contagion Engines or Isochron Scepters. Finally, Teferi's ultimate lets you use your Planeswalker's loyalty abilities during the opponent's turn as well as your own, so you can keep all of your lands untapped all of the time. Or well, 4 of your lands at a time. This deck's got a control strategy going. There's a suite of bounce and counter spells to keep your opponent's threats off the board, a lot of artifacts that spit out a bunch of mana to be untapped by Teferi's effect, like Fran Dynamo, Dreamstone Hedron, and of course Sol Ring. Then, once you've got all your mana flowing, the deck gives you some big creatures to spend it on, like Breaching Leviathan, Artisan of Kozilek, and Lorthos the Tidemaker. Finally, you can turn these big creatures into a win con using cards like Rite of Replication and Infinite Reflections to make a bunch of clones of them. This deck has aged a bit better than Forged in Stone, but that's mostly because it has Cyclonic Rift in it. Sworn to Darkness is commanded by Ob Nixilis of the Black Oath. Before he was a demonic mafioso, our man Ob was just a warmongering jerk who killed literally every other person on his home plane. This card depicts him right near the start of his character arc, just after his spark ignited, but before he got turned into a demon by the Chain Veil. For 5 mana, Ob Nixilis of the Black Oath comes in with 3 loyalty. For +2, he drains every opponent for 1 life and heals you equal to the amount of damage dealt this way. This is an ability that doesn't really do enough to impact the board at all. For -2, Ob Nixilis makes a 5/5 flying demon token, but also drains you for 2 life. For 5 mana, this is fine. You have to use Ob's +2 again in order to get another cast of this off though, which isn't great. If you can get this effect to go off twice, you've probably done something worthwhile with the 5 mana you invested into casting this card though. Finally, Ob Nixilis' ultimate grants you an emblem which provides you with the ability to pay 1 black mana and 1 mana of any colour in order to sacrifice a creature and gain life and draw cards equal to their power. This costs a steep 8 loyalty though, which you can't reach even if you bring Ob Nixilis out with a doubling season in play. While this card's certainly cool from a story perspective, it's always interesting to see the early stages of characters' arcs like this. To be honest, it's probably best to swap Ob out for Ghoulcaller Gisa, the included subcommander of the deck. This deck has a Sacrifice Matters theme, which Gisa plays into much better than Ob does. Like many decks from 2014, Sworn to Darkness exists to demonstrate what the colour it represents can do. Sworn to Darkness is packed with removal spells, sacrifice outlets, and cards which reward you when things die. Like all good mono black decks, Sworn to Darkness also features Gary, the Grey Merchant of Asphodel. This is a decent deck then, despite its less than exciting face commander. Built from scratch features by far the most popular commander from a 2014 precons, Daretti Scrap Savant. There are currently 2,666 Daretti decks on EDHREC, which is just less than twice the number that exists for the second most popular commander for this year, who we'll get around to discussing in a moment. What makes Daretti so good? Well, I'm going to read his abilities out of order, so we'll get to the best bit last. Daretti's +2 allows his controllers to discard up to 2 cards to draw that many cards from their deck. Whilst this doesn't actually generate any card advantage, you're net neutrally tossing and drawing the same amount of stuff, keep this ability in the back of your mind. Daretti's ultimate provides his controller with an emblem that returns any of their artifacts that go from the battlefield to the graveyard right back into play during the end step, a stupidly strong effect, but also one which is stupidly difficult to actually activate as it costs 10 loyalty. Finally, we come to the core of what makes Daretti great, his -2 ability. For 2 loyalty, Daretti sacrifices an artifact in play in order to return 1 from the graveyard to the battlefield. Note, there are absolutely no restrictions on the mana cost of a card which can be reanimated here, so it's perfectly possible to bring a Triplicate Titan or a Phyrexian Triniform into play on turn 4 using Daretti. Daretti's +2 ability, mentioned earlier, also helps you load your yard with powerful artifacts to reanimate, along with any number of other red effects like Goblin Engineer and Faithless Looting. Built from scratch as about what you would imagine giving its commander, it's an artifact deck chock full of Wormcoil engines and Myr Battlespheres to reanimate using Daretti's effect. It's also got a bunch of dragons in, most of whom don't really synergise with the deck's artifact strategy, but it's a mono-red commander deck from 2014, so there need to be dragons all over the place to fill out the top of the curve. This deck may be built from scratch, but the cards in it definitely aren't scrap. Guided by Nature is commanded by Freyalise, Llanowar's Fury. This Elven Avenger is a 5 mana threat, and while she's no Daretti, Freyalise is certainly a lot more viable in the command zone than Ob Nixilis of the Black Oath. Entering play with 3 loyalty, Freyalise can generate a creature token that's functionally a Llanowar elf for +2. She can destroy a targeted artifact or enchantment with her -2, and she allows her controller to draw a card for every green creature they control with her -6. This ability isn't super busted as far as ultimates go, but it's the ultimate from this set of 5 which is easily the easiest to get off, as Freyalise's +2 effect generates blockers for her and only takes 2 turns to charge this up. Guided by Nature is an elf Typal deck, with a few big cards like Thunderfoot Baloth and Terastodon thrown in at the top end to provide a bit of extra oomph. There is certainly no shortage of elf Typal commanders. Lathril is the gold standard as the third most popular commander of all time. And there's also Galadriel from a new elf-type on Middle-earth precon, who brings a scrying strategy into the mix. Even in mono green, Freyalise faces competition from Missouri Renegade leader and Marwyn the Nurturer. Nevertheless, Freyalise is a fine enough commander, especially if you like spitting out Llanowar elves forever and ever. Now, in terms of the card to represent Commander 2014, I should probably choose Commander Sphere. It's a staple 3-mana mana rock, happy to go in most decks. But, I don't know, that feels like a bit of a dull choice, and we've already chosen Command Tower. Instead, I'm going to grab Song of the Dryads. Included in the Freyalise precon, this removal spell is Mono Green's best friend and Mono Red's worst nightmare. The central idea of Commander is, well, that you should be able to use your Commander. After all, it's the card that you build your deck around. Song of the Dryads locks a player's Commander out of the game, potentially permanently if they don't have an answer for it. For 3 mana, this aura turns any targeted permanent into a forest, stripping it of its previous card types and subtypes. A commander hit with this becomes immediately useless. Mono red decks don't have a lot of enchantment removal, so short of something like Chaos Warp or Meteor Golem, they may not be able to get their commander back. There are many other variants of this effect, like Darksteel Mutation and Imprisoned in the Moon, but what makes Song of the Dryads so notable is the fact that it's green, a colour that normally has terrible removal when it comes to getting rid of creatures. All of the commanders from this deck were reprinted in Commander Masters, so new players can experiment with them. But, unlike Commander Masters boosters, they're currently pretty cheap, so pick some up if you want. Commander 2015 upgrades its design to the next level using a new mechanic called Experience Counters. All 5 of the commanders from this set care about these new counters. They have one effect that lets them generate them, and another effect which pays you off for having a bunch of them. The cards scale so that the more counters you generate with effect 1, the more powerful effect 2 becomes. Commander 2015 also debuted the Myriad ability, which clones attacking creatures so you can go after all your opponents at once, and gave us the Confluence Cycle, a series of 5 powerful modal spells that offer you a big grab bag of free effects that can be activated up to 3 times. Meeting halfway between the tricolour decks of 2011 and 2013 and the monocolour decks of 2014, 2015 gave us a series of decks based on enemy colour pairs. There's Call the Spirits in white and black, Seize Control in blue and red, Plunder the Graves in green and black, Wade into Battle in red and white, and finally Swell the Host in blue and green. Call the Spirits is commanded by Daxos the Returned, Elspeth Zombified X. A 3-mana 2/2, Daxos generates an experience counter whenever his controller casts an enchantment, and, for 3 mana, Daxos can generate a Spirit Enchantment creature token, with power and toughness equals the number of experience counters his controller has. Since these tokens are created by Daxos' ability, they aren't cast, meaning they don't generate any counters, which, well, to be honest, that's probably for the best.
While commanders that care about enchantments are a dime a dozen, Daxos the Returned is able to carve out a niche for himself by being in Orzhov. There are loads of Selesnya, Bant and Abzan enchantment commanders, but for pure Orzhov players looking to make an enchantment-themed deck, well, the choices are quite limited. Killian Ink Duelist can definitely care about enchantments, but more in a Voltron-y, cover him in lots of auras sort of way. There's also Naomi Pillar of Order, but that card's terrible, and it makes you chuck a few artifacts in as well. Ew! Just a quick aside here, I wrote that last section of script prior to the release of Wilds of Eldraine, which gave us 2 new Orzhov commanders that care about enchantments. Neva, Stalked by Nightmares, encourages a build focused on sacrificing enchantments, and Eriette of the Charmed Apple encourages loading your opponent's creatures with auras that'll slowly drain their life. So yeah, Orzhov enchantments isn't quite as niche a theme as it was when I started working on this script, but Daxos still has a role to play as the bread and butter enchantments matter commander for the colour pair. Alright, on with the programme.
Daxos can also adopt a bit of the Spirit sub-theme. Thanks to Innistrad Crimson Vow, Spirits and Enchantments synergize really nicely together, with cards like Catilda Dawnheart Martyr, Hallowed Haunting, and Twinblade Geist. Even just out of the box, Call the Spirits is a pretty good deck. I mean, it does what it says on the tin, and contains a bunch of enchantments and a bunch of other cards which care about enchantments, with a bit of life gain sprinkled in there to work with Karlov of the Ghost Council, the deck's sub-commander. Seize Control is an Izzet deck, and you know what that means. Spellslinging time! As Spellslinger decks go, Mizzix of the Ismagus is honestly pretty good. This 4-mana 2/2 generates an experience counter whenever their controller casts an instant or sorcery spell with a cost greater than the number of experience counters they currently have. Then, all of their controller's spells get a 1-mana discount per experience counter they've got. Mizzix works wonders when combined with lots of X spells. Since those spells have a variable casting cost, you can cast them very cheaply in the early game to help build up your counters, and then get huge discounts on them later on, enabling you to deal out a huge amount of damage using Comet Storm, or draw huge numbers of cards using Blue Sun Zenith. Since the power of instants and sorceries has come a long way since 2015, this deck definitely needs some fine tuning, but Mizzix is a pretty great commander that manages to stand out in the very, very crowded niche, which is Izzet Spellslinger. Plunder the Graves gets across its strategy pretty well with its title. This is a graveyard recursion deck, piloted by Meren of Clan Nel Toth. Meren is a 4-mana 3/4 that produces an experience counter whenever another one of her controller's creatures dies. During the end step, Meren brings back a creature from a graveyard, returning them directly to play if their mana value is less than or equal to the number of experience counters owned by her controller, or to the hand if it's greater. With over 10,000 decks to her name, Meren of Clan Nel Toth is currently the 25th most popular commander of all time. To get the most out of Meren, you'll need to run some sacrifice stuff so that she can get started collecting counters. This doesn't necessarily mean putting in a whole sacrifice sub-theme with cards like Viscera Seer and Blood Artist, but that's absolutely a possibility if you want to pursue it. Creatures that sack themselves to give you an advantage of some sort are hugely useful in Meren decks. Out of the box, Plunder the Graves comes with Sakura Tribe-Elder and Viridian Zealot, and you can throw in cards like Spore Frog or Canker Balloon. Cards like this work great, because they cost a low amount of mana, so they can come in early, blow themselves up to give you a bit of value, and then be reanimated by Meren to repeat this process all over again. Beyond this, just run the usual self-mill stuff graveyard decks like to rely on. The deck comes with a Satyr Wayfinder and a Mulch to get you started. Although these days, if you're building a graveyard deck, make sure to bring along everyone's favourite pal, Sir Conrad the Grim, for a consistent source of ping damage as your deck does its thing. Like Mizzix, Meren is a popular commander in a popular theme. She sets herself apart from the pack of other graveyard commanders by offering a reliable, recurring source of reanimation. We're about to trudge into analysing Wade into Battle, and oh boy, this one's widely regarded as one of the worst EDH precons of all time. While Kalemni, Disciple of Iroas, isn't the least popular pre-commander of them all, she's down in the same tier as Teferi, Nahiri and Ob Nixilis as a member of the sub-1000 gang. At least those three are all cool mono-coloured planeswalkers. Kalemni is just, well, a bit of a mess. For 4 mana, Kalemni is a 3/3 giant soldier with vigilance and double strike. She gets +1/+1 for each experience counter her controller has, and generates an experience counter whenever her controller plays a creature that costs 5 or more mana. The issue here is there's a fundamental conflict between the condition Kalemni uses to generate more counters and her payoff for having lots of counters. Kalemni gives you a counter for casting big creature spells that cost 5 or more. This indicates you want to use her as the commander of a big creatures matter deck, and indeed this is what Wade into Battle is trying to be. It's got a whole bunch of giant typal cards like Sunrise Sovereign and Thundercloud Shaman. The payoff for playing all of your giants though is that only Kalemni gets bigger, getting a +1/+1 bonus for each 5 mana value or greater creature you play. This is the sort of reward a Voltron deck would want, as rather than encouraging you to build a big board of creatures, these +1/+1 buffs are encouraging you to build up your commander alone. If Kalemni's ability gave +1/+1 to all giants, she'd work a lot better as a typal commander. Conversely, if she generated counters whenever she was targeted by an aura or given a piece of equipment, she'd be a much better Voltron commander. As it stands, Kalemni just sort of awkwardly straddles two strategies, not quite working for either one. Kalemni also would have worked a lot better in green. 2015 Boros is not a colour pair with a great deal of access to ramp. A partially green Kalemni would enable her controller to rush out lots of lands so they can slam down their giants more rapidly and more reliably. But this is just the latest theoretical tweak that won't happen to make this interesting but flawed commander work. While Kalemni is a bit of a mess, Azuri Claw of Progress, the commander of Swell the Host, knows exactly what he wants to do. This Phyrexianized elf is a 4 mana 3/3 that generates an experience counter whenever his controller plays a creature with power 2 or less. Notably, it's a lot easier to play creatures with power 2 or less than it is to play creatures that cost 5 or more, giving Azuri a pretty massive edge over Kalemni. Then, Azuri gives a creature a number of +1/+1 counters equal to the number of experience counters his controller has at the start of each combat step, an ability which, in almost every context, is more useful than Kalemni's ability to give only herself +1/+1 for all her controller's experience counters. Okay, this is the last time I'm going to dunk on this poor Boros Giantess, I swear. Azuri wants you to play a lot of small creatures and then pump them all full of +1/+1 counters until they become massive. Then, once you've built up a huge board of small but mighty monsters coated in +1/+1 counters, you use an Overrun effect to secure a win. The deck actually contains a copy of Overrun, which is cute. No Crater Hoof though. While Azuri is a simple and well executed go wide with +1/+1 counters commander, Swell the Host is a bit messy as a deck. For no particular reason, there's a snake sub-theme, with the card Kaseto Orochi Archmage serving as the deck's backup commander. Some of these serpent cards, like Patagia Viper and Lawscale Coatl, work really well with the deck's theme of play a bunch of creatures with power 2 or less and then buff them with +1/+1 counters. Some of them, like Broodbirth Viper, really don't. There's also just a few random big creatures like Arbor Colossus that don't really serve a purpose and seem to be in the deck largely due to a belief that commander decks should have big creatures in them. Uzuri is still a great commander, but he's in charge of a deck that's a little discordant. These precons have come a long way from 2011, but they've still got a ways to go before they're up to current standards. As for our card to represent Commander 2015, let's go with Mizzix's Mastery. This card serves as the win con for any good Spellslinger deck. Over the course of a commander game, when you're playing Izzet, you're going to build up a huge pile of instants and sorceries in your graveyard. An overloaded Mizzix's Mastery brings them all crashing back into action once again, likely winning you the game, or at least putting you several miles ahead of each of your opponents. Even the 4-mana effect to recur a single spell is honestly still pretty decent. We've actually had a few more legendary creatures that care about experience counters in the years since 2015. Kelsien the Plague from 2020's Ikoria Commander decks, Minthara Merciless Soul in 2022's Battle for Baldur's Gate, and Afori Sun's Glory from the Phyrexia All-1 precons that were released earlier this year. It can be fun to mash lots of these experience counter cards into a single deck with 4 or maybe 5 colours, and then using a commander that cares about proliferating counters. Generate one counter somehow, and then proliferate until you've got a whole bunch of experience, and watch as the effects of these cards scale out of control. I'm sure you're all thinking of one particular commander that this strategy would work well with, even if they don't have access to reds. But, well, we'll have to wait, because we'll be discussing them in our next video. So here we are, halfway through the first round of EDH precons. We've discussed 2011, 2013, 2014, and 2015. Next time, we'll be discussing 2016, 2017, 2018, and 2019. Maybe after that we'll start talking about each of the commander decks that are now released alongside every new set these days. I'm honestly not really sure yet. Commander's a pretty great way of playing Magic the Gathering though. It brings a sort of Mario Party-esque chaos to the game that many players enjoy. Wizards of the Coast have ramped up their support for the format considerably throughout its lifespan. Commander moved from the humble beginnings we discussed here through to becoming one of the most popular ways to play the game. There are more Commander gameplay channels out there than you can shake a Beamtown beatstick at, which stands as a testament to how it's probably also one of the most exciting formats to watch. Was Commander better when it was slow-paced and all about slamming down huge expensive creatures in these early days, or is the format more fun now, with the huge variety of decks of different qualities and speeds that are on offer? Who honestly knows? But one thing's for sure, even after all these years, some of the commanders from these first batches of decks like Kaalia, the Mimeoplasm, Mizzix and Prosh are still absolutely fantastic.